In 1894, in a stone building at the edge of the New Mexico desert, an army surgeon sat with a lamp and a stack of paper, writing down something he had been warned he was never meant to hear. He was not a treasure hunter. He was not a mystic. He was a trained physician, a man of instruments and careful measurements, and the thing he was writing did not fit anywhere in the science of his time. An old Navajo singer had spent night after night explaining to him, slowly and exactly, that the ground beneath them was not the first ground, that this world, the one with its sun and its mountains and its rivers, was not the first world. It was the latest, the most recent survivor in a long sequence of worlds that had come before it. And each of those earlier worlds, the old man said, had ended, not faded, not softened into a bedtime story, ended, emptied out and sealed shut and left behind, one after another, for reasons that sound less like folklore the longer you sit with them, and more like a report, a record of what keeps happening to a world full of people who repeat the same mistake. His name was Washington Matthews, and what the Navajo told him about the world before this one remains, more than a century later, one of the strangest things ever set down on paper by a man with nothing to gain from inventing it. Because Matthews wrote all of it down. Every world, every ending, every reason. And then, in the additions that came later, after other hands had touched his work, some of it quietly went missing. If you want the version of history that stops exactly where the school textbook stops, this is not the channel for you. But if you have ever stood somewhere old and felt that the official story has holes in it wide enough to fall through, take 1 second and subscribe right now, because we are about to climb down into those holes together. And I promise you, we do not come back up the same way we went in. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who Washington Matthews actually was. Because the easiest way to bury an uncomfortable account is to say it came from someone unreliable, a dreamer, a fraud, a man selling something. Matthews was none of those things. He was born in Ireland in 1843 and brought to the United States as a small child. He trained as a physician, and when the country tore itself apart in civil war, he served as a surgeon. Afterward, the army sent him west, to the frontier forts scattered across a landscape most Americans of the time thought of as empty. It was not empty. It was full of people whose histories reached back further than anyone in Washington wanted to admit, and Matthews, unlike almost everyone around him, decided to actually listen to them. You have to understand what that made him in his own time. In the late 1800s, the official attitude toward the people of the American West was not curiosity. It was erasure. Their languages were being stamped out in boarding schools. Their ceremonies were being outlawed. The prevailing scientific opinion held that these were vanishing peoples, primitive, doomed, worth studying only the way you might study a species about to go extinct. Matthews absorbed some of that language because everyone of his era did. But something in him refused the conclusion. He did not see a doomed primitive when he sat across from a Navajo singer. He saw a scholar, a man holding an enormous and precisely ordered body of knowledge in his head, with no book, no archive, nothing but memory and discipline. And Matthews understood, earlier than almost anyone, that if that memory died, it would not be a quaint loss. It would be the destruction of a library that had never been copied. Keep that phrase in your mind as we go, because it turns out to be the key to everything that follows. A library that had never been copied. Everything the Navajo knew about the worlds before this one existed in exactly one form: spoken, remembered, performed. There was no master volume sitting in a vault somewhere that you could go and check against. If the chain of memory broke, the knowledge did not become rare, it became non-existent. And Matthews was watching that chain, link by fragile link, grow thinner in front of him with every year that passed. At Fort Wingate, in the high desert of what is now New Mexico, he began to learn the Navajo language, not a handful of trading words. The real thing. Its grammar, its rhythm, the way meaning could turn on a sound so slight that most outsiders never even heard it. And because he took the time, because he treated the people in front of him as keepers of knowledge rather than obstacles to be moved out of the way, doors opened for him that stayed shut to nearly every other white man of his century. Navajo singers, the men who carried the sacred ceremonies alive in their memory, began to trust him. They let him sit in on rites that outsiders were never meant to witness. The mountain chant, the night chant, a ceremony of such staggering length and precision that a single error in its performance was believed to bring sickness or even death. Matthews watched, and listened, and wrote. And what he witnessed was not what most people picture when they imagine a native ceremony. The night chant alone ran for 9 nights, an unbroken machine of song and prayer and movement that had to unfold in a precise order from the first note to the last. Matthews sat through it. He counted the songs. He mapped the paintings. He documented dry paintings so intricate that a team of men laboured over them for the better part of a day, laying down coloured sand a pinch at a time to build images the size of a room, only to sweep them away entirely before the sun came up. Nothing about it was casual. Nothing about it was improvised. Every element existed because it had always existed, in that place, in that order, and to change it was not artistic license. It was a violation with consequences. Matthews, a physician who had spent his career watching what happens when systems fail, recognized something in that. He was looking at a system designed never to fail, a system built to carry something across time without letting it decay. And the thing it was built to carry was the story of where the people had come from. In 1897 he published a book called Navajo Legends. It was not a pamphlet of campfire tales. It was a careful ethnographic record, produced through a respected scholarly society, footnoted and cross-checked. The work of a man trying to preserve something he understood was slipping away in front of him. And at the centre of that book sat an account so vast and so strange that most readers, then and now, simply slide past it without ever letting it land. The account of the worlds before this one. The instinct, the moment you hear a phrase like that, is to file it away instantly. A creation myth, a nice piece of cultural colour, something for a museum placard. And that reflex, that little mental shrug, is exactly why almost nobody has ever actually reckoned with what Matthews recorded. Because a creation myth tells you how the world was made. This is not that. This is something else. This is an account of how the world was made several times, and unmade several times, and how the people telling you the story are the survivors of the ones that did not make it. That is not a story about beginnings. It is a story about endings, plural, and about the narrow, frightened, upward escape that happens after each one. And it was told not as poetry, but as memory. Here is what the Navajo told him, in its simplest form. This is not the first world. Human beings did not begin here. They arrived here, climbing up from below, refugees from a series of earlier worlds that had each become impossible to live in. The people did not fall from the sky. They came up, from underneath, through an opening, and behind them, as they climbed, world after world was left sealed and abandoned in the dark. Read that again, slowly, because we skate right over it. Left sealed, abandoned, in the dark. Those are not the words of a gentle origin story about the dawn of the people. Those are the words you use for something you fled. The Navajo account of where human beings come from is, at its foundation, an account of escape, not a garden we were placed in. A series of rooms we climbed out of, one after another, closing each door behind us, because staying meant dying. And if you have ever wondered why the deepest human stories, in almost every culture on earth, carry that same undertone of loss and expulsion, and a paradise that is always behind us and never ahead, this is where that question starts to get uncomfortable. The number of those worlds is not fixed in exactly the same way in every telling, and I want to be honest with you about that, because the people who flatten this into a tidy chart usually have something to sell. Some Diné accounts count 3 worlds below this one. Some count 4. Some describe 5 in total, this one included. The tradition is living, it is sacred, and it was never meant to be reduced to a spreadsheet. But across the tellings that Matthews and the ethnographers after him recorded, the shape holds with an eerie consistency. A world, a crisis, an expulsion, or a catastrophe. A climb upward into a new and larger world. And then, in time, the same thing again. Think about what that actually describes. Not a single creation, finished and blessed and permanent. A stack, a layered sequence of inhabited worlds, each one a floor above the last, each one ending in a way that drove its people upward to start over from almost nothing. The elders did not present this as a gentle metaphor for personal growth. They presented it as what happened. History. The record of where the people had physically been before they ever stood where they now stood. There is a word we reach for when we want to make an idea like that harmless. We call it symbolic. The worlds represent stages of the soul, we say. The climb represents growth. The flood represents change. And maybe, but that is our reflex, not theirs. The singers who carried this account did not talk about it the way you talk about a symbol. They talked about it the way you talk about a place you have been. They knew the names of the mountains in the worlds below. They knew which direction the rivers ran. They knew what the light was like, and what grew there, and who was already living there when the people arrived. You do not accumulate that kind of specific, physical, geographic detail about a metaphor. You accumulate it about a memory. And the more of that detail Matthews wrote down, the harder it became for him to keep telling himself it was only a metaphor. And the deeper you go into that record, the less it reads like innocent myth, and the more it reads like the memory of something that keeps repeating, something that has already come for us before, more than once, and left almost no one behind to remember it. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the world before this one, the names of the worlds that were erased and what ended each one, the full sequence of the beings who climbed out and what they carried up with them, and Washington Matthews' own field record from the 1890s, transcribed line by line with the passages that later editions quietly left out. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The first world, in the tellings Matthews recorded, was small and dark. Some singers called it the Black World. There was no sun in it, no moon, none of the clean, bright order we take for granted. There was mist, and there was colour bleeding in from the four directions, and there was a kind of dim, close, underground light that came from nowhere you could point to. It was not empty, it was crowded. But the beings who lived there were not yet people, the way you would recognize a person. They were described as insect beings, air spirit people, creatures that had the shape of ants and beetles and dragonflies and the will of something more. First man and first woman come into being in these early worlds. So does Coyote, who will follow the people up through every world after, causing trouble at every level, a figure who is never quite the villain and never quite the hero. And already, in that first dark world, you can see the machinery of the whole thing being assembled, colours assigned to directions. Black and blue and yellow and white, one for each world in the sequence, so that the very structure of the cosmos is colour-coded, layered, ordered like the floors of a building. This is not the loose, dreamlike logic people expect from myth. It is architectural. Someone, somewhere, across an unimaginable span of time, organised this into a system with rules, and then built a ceremony robust enough to carry that system intact across the centuries. When Matthews mapped it out, he was not transcribing a fever dream. He was reverse engineering a structure, and structures have builders. And this first world ended the way, it turns out, most of them end. Not from outside. From inside, the beings quarrelled. They committed offences against one another that the old accounts describe with a bluntness that surprises people who expect myth to be gentle. Betrayal, the breaking of trust, a breakdown of the agreements that had held the world together. And the powers of that world finally told them the same thing that would be told to their descendants again and again. You cannot stay here. You have ruined this place. Go up. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the pattern in miniature, and everything else is going to rhyme with it. A world is given. The people fill it. The people corrupt it. The world becomes unlivable, and they are forced to abandon it and climb. The first world was not destroyed by a flood or a fire from the sky. It was destroyed by the behaviour of the ones living inside it, until staying was simply no longer possible. And the door closed behind them. But before that door closed, the first world gave the people something they would carry with them forever, and it is worth pausing on. In the darkness of that first place, the essential things were established. The four directions, the first mountains, the beings who would become the powers of the world to come. First man and first woman did not just exist there. They gathered things. In some tellings they carried something up out of every world they left, seeds of what mattered, tucked away, brought forward. The people who climbed out of the first world were not starting from zero. They were carrying the salvaged pieces of a place that no longer existed. Every world after this one would be built, in part, out of what was rescued from the world below it. Which means this world, the one you live in, is built out of salvage too, out of things carried up through the dark from places that are gone. They climbed up into the second world, and it was larger. Some called it the Blue World. Here there were new inhabitants already in residence, bird people, swallows in great numbers, bluebirds, creatures of the air who had built their own settlements and were not especially pleased to find newcomers arriving from below. For a while, in the second world, there was something close to diplomacy. The people and the bird nations tried to share the space. There were negotiations, arrangements, an uneasy coexistence between the ones who had come up from below and the ones who had always been there. If you were looking for the moment the account could have broken its own pattern, this is it. A second world, larger and brighter than the first, with the chance to do it differently, the chance to remember what went wrong last time and choose another way. There were mountains here that had not existed in the cramped dark of the world beneath. There was more room, more light, more possibility than the people had ever known. And it went wrong again. This is the detail that should raise the hair on your arms if you are paying attention. The people had just been expelled from one world for their conflicts, their appetites, their inability to live at peace with one another. They had been given a second chance in a larger, brighter place, and they repeated themselves almost exactly. There was conflict with the bird people. There were the same old offences, the same failures of restraint, the same grasping for what belonged to someone else. The second world could not hold them either. And once again the message came down from the powers of that place. You have done it again, go up. 2 words, go up. The account delivers the end of a world in 2 words, the way a judge delivers a sentence, and then it simply moves on to the climb. There is no mourning written into it, no eulogy for the second world. And that flatness, that refusal to dwell, is itself a kind of horror. The ending of an entire inhabited world has become so routine, so expected, that the account barely pauses over it. It has happened before. It will happen again. Go up. Next world. 2 worlds now. 2 identical endings. Not 2 different disasters. The same disaster, twice, delivered by the same flaw in the same people. If this were a story someone invented to explain where the Navajo came from, you would expect variety. A flood here, a monster there, a clever escape, a triumphant arrival worth boasting about. Instead, the early record is grimly repetitive, almost clinical. The people are given a world. The people break it. The people are evicted upward. It reads less like a fairy tale and more like a physician's case notes on a recurring illness, which, of course, is exactly what Washington Matthews was trained to write. And I want you to notice what is missing from these first 2 worlds, because its absence is the whole point. There is no villain from outside, no invading army, no cruel god hurling down punishment for sport, no cosmic accident. The threat, in every case, is the people themselves. The worlds do not fail, the inhabitants fail them. Over and over the account refuses to let its own ancestors off the hook, and that refusal is the strongest evidence that this is not vanity literature. Nobody invents a national origin story in which their forefathers are repeatedly and specifically the reason paradise keeps collapsing. You invent heroes, you invent enemies to blame. The Navajo account does the opposite. It looks straight at the flaw and names it, generation after generation, world after world, and it does not blink. The third world was larger still. Some singers called it the Yellow World, and this is where the account swells into something that stops feeling like a simple sequence and starts feeling like the world we almost recognize. Because the third world had real geography. It had great rivers, one running east to west, one running north to south, crossing in the very middle of everything. It had mountains standing at the 4 directions and a mountain rising in the center. It had grasshopper people, and the beginnings of the plants and the animals and the order that would one day define the world to come. If you had wandered into the third world, you might have believed, for a while, that you had finally arrived somewhere permanent. You had not, because here is what happened in the third world before the water came, and it is the detail the tidy summaries almost always skip. There was a long stretch of something like order. The people learned to farm. They built. They organized themselves. Men and women, in one of the strangest and most human episodes in the whole account, quarrelled so badly that they separated entirely, living apart on opposite banks of a great river, each convinced they could do without the other. And they nearly destroyed themselves doing it. The account lingers on this, on the pride and the stubbornness and the slow ruin of a people who had everything they needed and could not stop tearing at each other anyway. It is not a story about innocence lost. It is a study of a functioning world that rotted from the inside while its people insisted everything was fine. And only after all of that, after the world had already been hollowed out by its own inhabitants, does the flood arrive to finish what they started. Because the third world is where the great catastrophe enters the story, not a slow moral decay this time, a sudden, rising, overwhelming flood. And the way that flood is triggered is one of the most quietly disturbing details in the entire account, because the destruction of an entire world hangs on a single act of theft and a single refusal to make it right. In the third world lived a being of the deep water. In the tellings Matthews and others recorded, it is often called the water monster, a powerful creature that governed the rivers and the water beneath them. And Coyote, who, as always, has followed the people upward and who, as always, cannot leave well enough alone, does something unforgivable. He steals the water monster's children. He hides them under his robe. And the water, which is to say the power of the deep itself, responds the only way such a power can. It rises. And I want to be fair to Coyote here, because he is not simply a thief in a cartoon. In this tradition, Coyote is something far more unsettling than a villain. He is the part of the people that cannot help itself. He is appetite without patience, curiosity without wisdom, the impulse to grab the shining thing and deal with the consequences later. He is not an outsider who wandered in to ruin things. He came up the reed with everyone else, world after world, because he is one of them. He is the floor, walking around in a body, following the people upward through every world they climb into, and reaching for the one thing he was told not to touch. When the account blames the flood on Coyote, it is not letting the people off the hook. It is telling you that the thing which drowns worlds is not out there somewhere. It travels with you. It has always travelled with you. And that single idea, that the thing which destroys worlds is not an external enemy but a passenger, is the most modern thing in this entire ancient account. We spend enormous effort imagining the threats that will end us as things that arrive from outside. The asteroid, the invader, the plague out of nowhere. The Navajo account quietly refuses that comfort. In 3 worlds running, nothing came from outside. The danger was always already inside the reed, riding up with the survivors, wearing a familiar face, reaching for the one thing it was told to leave alone. If you want to know what ends the next world, the account says, do not scan the horizon. Look hard at what you brought up with you. Understand what the people in the third world witnessed. It was not rain. It was the water itself coming up, from below, from the rivers and the springs and the ground, a wall of it advancing across the whole world at once, swallowing the mountains one after another. And here the people, for the first time in the whole sequence, do something right. They run, they gather. They climb the tallest mountain in the centre of the world as the water closes in around its base. And when the mountain is not enough, they do the thing that will define them forever after. They plant a reed. A single great hollow reed that grows upward toward the sky faster than the water can rise, and they climb inside it, all of them, every being that will inhabit the world to come, packed into one hollow shaft racing upward ahead of a flood that is erasing everything below. And I need you to hold on to that image, because it is one of the most haunting pictures in all of human memory, and it appears in more places than it has any right to, a single vertical escape from a drowning world. Not a boat riding the surface, though the account has echoes of that too. A shaft, a tube, a hollow column, driven straight up out of a world that is filling with water, with the last survivors of everything crammed inside it and climbing for their lives. Think of every flood story you have ever heard. Then think about how strange it is that a desert people, in a place where the great danger is drought and not deluge, preserved with total conviction a memory of the entire world drowning from below. Where does a people who fear thirst get a flood that swallows continents? You do not invent your deepest terror out of the thing you have never seen. You inherit it. You carry it up the reed with everything else. And notice who does not make it. The account is quiet about this, the way real disasters are quiet about it, but the implication is there in the arithmetic. Everyone who inhabited the world to come was in the reed, which means everyone who was not in the reed is simply gone. A whole world of beings, an entire populated place with its rivers and its mountains, and its cities of birds and insects, and the people who quarrelled on the riverbanks, all of it sealed under rising water, and only a fraction climbing up the shaft into the next world to become the ancestors of everything that follows. We are, in this telling, descended entirely from the ones who got up the reed in time, which is another way of saying we are descended from the survivors of a deletion, and the deleted do not get a chapter. They get a flood, and a sealed door, and silence. And still the water comes. It follows them up the inside of the reed, and as they climb, someone finally understands the terrible truth. The flood will not stop, because the theft has not been undone. The water monster's children are still hidden among them. Coyote still has them under his robe. Only when the stolen children are at last given back, drop down into the rising water, does the flood halt. The price of survival was returning what had been taken. The people lived because, at the very last possible moment, they corrected the crime that was drowning their world. Read that one more time, because it is the closest thing this entire account has to a law. The flood did not stop when the people prayed hard enough. It did not stop when they found a hero, or a weapon, or a clever trick. It stopped at the precise instant they returned what had been stolen. The catastrophe was reversible right up until it wasn't, and the thing that reversed it was restitution, giving back, undoing the theft. That is not how most flood stories work, where the water is simply divine punishment and all you can do is float and wait for it to recede. In this one, the survivors have agency to the very end, and the account is brutally specific about what that agency consists of. Not cleverness, not strength, the willingness to give back the thing you took. Remember that. It is going to matter enormously by the time we reach the bottom of this. That is the end of the third world, sealed beneath a flood that only stopped when a wrong was made right. And the survivors climbed out of the top of the reed into the world above, soaked and terrified and reduced to the handful who had made it up the shaft in time. Now, before I tell you what they found up there and what came up with them, I have to stop again. Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the flood that ended the third world is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original account Matthew's recorded. The flood's direction, the final count of survivors, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The place the survivors climbed into is the world we are standing in right now. In the tellings it is sometimes called the glittering world, or the white world, or simply the world of the surface. And the first thing that happened, the very first act after the emergence, tells you exactly how seriously the people took what they had just escaped. They sealed the opening. They had come up through a hole from the drowned world below, and they did not leave that hole open behind them. In the accounts, the place of emergence is closed, marked, guarded. Some versions describe water still standing in it, a lake, a permanent reminder pressing up from underneath. The point is consistent across the tellings. Whatever was down there was not meant to follow them up. The door to the world before this one was shut on purpose, and it was shut by people who had just watched a world die and had no intention whatsoever of letting it reach them. Think about how strange that is as a thing to invent. If you were making up a triumphant origin story, you would not spend your first moments in the shining new world, nervously sealing the exit behind you and posting a guard on it. You do that when something is chasing you. You do that when you know, from direct and recent experience, exactly what happens when the door is left open. There is a strange little echo of this in cultures that never met the Navajo, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. All over the world, sacred sites are built over openings that are then sealed, caves that are closed and guarded, springs and wells treated as doorways to a world below that must not be reopened. Underworlds you can descend to, but must never let ascend. The specific instinct the Navajo account describes, that the place you climbed up from is dangerous and must be kept shut, is not unique to one desert. It is one of the most widespread religious impulses on the planet. as if a great many peoples, in a great many places, arrived at the same conclusion. Whatever is down there stays down there. Seal it, mark it, and never, ever let it come back up. But sealing the door did not make the new world safe, because something had already come up with them. This is where the account turns from the story of a migration into the story of a war. The world the people emerged into was not empty and waiting for them. It was infested. The old records call them the monsters, the alien beings, the enemies. Some of them, in the darkest strand of the tradition, were said to have been born out of the people's own worst behavior in the worlds below, given flesh and set loose in the new world to hunt the very beings who had created them. Giants that ate people. A creature that kicked travelers off the edges of cliffs. Monsters of every kind ranged across the land, so numerous and so deadly that humanity was very nearly wiped out before it could even take root. The people had survived the flood only to arrive in a world that was actively trying to finish the job. And where did these monsters come from? The tradition gives an answer so psychologically precise that it is hard to believe it is thousands of years old. In the darkest and most consistent strand, the monsters are born from the wrongs the people committed in the worlds below, and specifically from acts of secrecy and appetite that were never made right. Those wrongs did not simply vanish when the people climbed the reed. They came up too. They took on flesh in the new world. They grew into giants and horrors that then stalked the very descendants of the ones who created them. Think about what that is actually saying. Your unaddressed wrongs do not stay behind you. They climb up with you into the new world, and they grow, and eventually they come hunting. That is not a fairy tale about ogres. That is a theory of consequence so unflinching it could have been written yesterday. And here the account gives us its heroes. Changing Woman, one of the most important holy beings in the entire tradition, a figure who embodies the earth itself and the turning of the seasons and the renewal of life. And her two sons, the hero twins, Monster Slayer and Born for Water. Born to do exactly what their names promise. They journey to their father, the sun, across a road lined with tests designed to kill them before they ever arrive. That road was no gentle pilgrimage. It was lined with things built to kill anyone who walked it. Crushing rocks, cutting reeds, boiling sands, creatures that tore travelers apart. And when the twins finally reached the sun, their own father did not welcome them. He tested them, nearly killed them, tried to destroy them with heat and poison and violence to prove they were truly his. There is nothing soft in this account anywhere. Even the heroes sent to save the world had to be forged half to death first. The people who preserved this were not telling their children that rescue is easy, or that the powers above are kind. They were telling them that survival is earned, brutally, by those willing to walk a road built to end them. They are given weapons. And they come back down into the world, and they hunt the monsters, one by one, across the whole landscape, clearing the new world of the horrors that had come up out of the old one, so that ordinary people could finally live in it. But even the hero twins, and this is crucial, do not kill everything. In the account, certain monsters are spared. Old age, cold, poverty, hunger. When Monster Slayer comes for them, each one makes the same argument. Kill me, and you kill something the world needs. Without me, the young would never make room for those who come after. Without me, people would not value warmth, or food, or effort. And the twins, astonishingly, let them live. The world was not made safe. It was made survivable. The horrors that came up from below were cleared just enough that life could take hold, but the hardest facts of existence were left standing on purpose, because a world with no death and no want and no cold is not a world at all. Even the cleansing of this world was a negotiation. Even our paradise was a compromise with the things that climbed up out of the dark. And the world they finally settled into was small and hard-won and haunted by the knowledge of everything underneath it. This is the world we inherited. Not a fresh creation handed to us clean, but a fourth or a fifth attempt, built on the sealed graves of the ones that failed, cleared just barely enough to be livable by heroes who spared death itself, because a world without death could not function. When you understand the account this way, the ground under your feet changes character. It stops being neutral. It becomes the lid on something. A surface stretched over layers of abandoned worlds, each with its own dead, each sealed by survivors who did not want to be followed. You are not standing on the beginning of things. You are standing on the roof of everything that came before, and the account you have just heard is a set of directions carried up through all of it, for what to do when the roof starts to leak. Look at the shape of this. The people escape a dying world. They seal it behind them, and then they have to fight and kill the things that escaped alongside them, the consequences of their own past, made monstrous and set loose in the present. It is one of the most psychologically sophisticated stories any culture has ever produced, and it was being recited from memory in exact ceremonial order by singers in the desert, decades before any outsider bothered to decide their oral tradition was worth writing down at all. And it is here, standing in the wreckage of that idea, that a certain kind of researcher stops taking notes and starts asking a very different question, because the Navajo are not alone. That is the thing that gnaws at people once they see it. This idea of a world before this one, a previous age that was populated and complete and then destroyed and buried, survivors climbing up or fleeing out into a reset world, is not some isolated quirk of one people in one desert. It is nearly everywhere. It is in the flood that drowns the world in the stories of the ancient Near East. It is in the ages of the world that the Greeks described, a golden age and the fallen ages that followed it, each one worse than the last. It is in the sequence of suns and destroyed worlds in the traditions of central Mexico, where previous humanities were said to have been wiped out by wind and by fire and by water. It is in the drowned lands remembered on the edges of a dozen far-flung coastlines. Different peoples, different languages, no contact between many of them, all circling the very same haunted idea that this is not the first time, that there was a before, and that the before ended badly, and it goes further than floods and golden ages. There is a very specific flavour to the modern suspicion, the one that has spread across the internet in the last several years under a dozen different names, and it fixates on a particular kind of evidence. Buildings that seem too old, or too advanced, or too buried. Cities that appear in the record fully formed with no clear ancestry. Layers of mud and silt across the world that the official story explains one careful way and that a restless mind explains another. Structures with their first floors sunk below street level, as if a wave of earth once rolled through and the world was simply rebuilt on top of it. The people who follow this thread are looking, whether they say it plainly or not, for the sealed door, for the physical evidence of the world before this one, for the seam where the reset happened. And the Navajo account, recorded by a sober army surgeon a century before any of this became an internet obsession, tells them, in effect, that the seam is real, that the reset happened more than once, and that the people who climbed out of it sealed the evidence behind them on purpose. There is one more piece to this that almost nobody connects, and it is the eeriest of all. Ask yourself why we, the current world, remember so little. If there were worlds before this one, complete and populated and real, why is our grip on them so faint that it survives only as ceremony and myth? The account has a quiet answer folded into it. The survivors were few. They came up traumatized and stripped down, carrying almost nothing, sealing the past behind them because the past was trying to kill them. Memory does not survive a reset intact. It survives the way a story survives a house fire, in fragments, in the few things someone thought to grab on the way out the door. We are not a people who forgot our history through carelessness. We are, if the account is right, a people descended from refugees who deliberately did not look back, because looking back meant drowning. Our amnesia is not an accident. It is a survival strategy that works so well it erased the very thing it was protecting us from. And here is where the skeptic and the believer finally stand on the same ground, whether they like it or not, because you do not actually have to believe in a lost super-civilization to be disturbed by this. You only have to accept a simpler and far better documented fact. Human beings have lived through the total collapse of their world many times over. The people of the Bronze Age watched a whole interconnected civilization fall apart in a single generation and did not fully understand why for another 3,000 years. Whole cities have been swallowed by sand and sea and jungle, and simply forgotten, rediscovered by accident centuries later by people who had no idea anyone had ever lived there. Collapse is not a fringe theory. Collapse is the single most reliable feature of human history. Worlds do end. They have ended, again and again, for the people living in them. The only thing the Navajo account adds is the suggestion that it has happened more times and further back than we are willing to count. and that we are not the exception. We are just the current tenants. Now, the careful historian has an explanation for that, and it deserves to be said plainly and fairly. Floods are universal. Every culture that lives near water remembers a bad one. Human beings everywhere are prone to imagining a lost golden age, because the past always looks simpler and cleaner than the present moment we are struggling through. Convergent storytelling is real, and on its own it is not proof of a hidden history. That is the responsible position, and I am not going to pretend it away or hide it from you. But there is another current of thought, and this is the one that has pulled so many people down the rabbit hole in recent years, that looks at all these scattered memories of a destroyed and buried previous world, and asks a heretical question. What if the reason so many peoples remember the same erased world is that there actually was one? What if the memory is not a coincidence of the human imagination, but the fading echo of a real event? A previous age, a previous civilization, wiped from the surface and buried under mud and water so completely and so thoroughly that all that survived was the story itself, carried upward by the handful who climbed out, and told and retold until only the shape of it remained. This is the intuition that lives at the very heart of the whole underground conversation about a hidden history, the sense that our neat, official timeline, the one that runs in a clean, straight line from cave to farm to city to us, is quietly hiding a seam, a reset, a point where something that was here before was covered over, and a new world was calmly told that it was the first. And when you are already carrying that suspicion, and then you sit down and read what an army surgeon wrote down in the 1890s from the mouths of people who had no earthly reason to be feeding you anything, and you find a detailed, sober, ceremonially exact account of exactly that, worlds destroyed, worlds buried, survivors sealing the door behind them, it stops feeling like folklore. It starts to feel like testimony. I'm not going to stand here and tell you the mainstream explanation is simply wrong. I am going to tell you that the people who recorded these accounts, Matthews chief among them, were not fools, and they came away from the work unsettled. And the question of why the whole human species seems to remember a world that officially never existed is not a question our textbooks have ever actually answered. They have simply, quietly, agreed among themselves not to ask it out loud. Which brings us back to the man with the lamp. Because Washington Matthews did not treat what he was hearing as a charming primitive myth, and that is the detail almost everyone misses. He was a scientist to his bones, and the thing that struck him, the thing he kept returning to again and again, was not how fanciful the account was, it was how precise it was. The Navajo were not improvising, they were reciting. The great ceremonies he witnessed, the ones that carried these accounts inside them, had to be performed with an exactness that is genuinely difficult for an outsider to even comprehend. Hundreds of songs in a fixed and unbreakable order. Sand paintings of enormous complexity, built up grain by grain over many hours, and then deliberately destroyed before nightfall, that had to be reproduced from memory with perfect fidelity, because a single misplaced element was believed to be dangerous to everyone present. This was not a loose oral tradition drifting freely and casually from one teller to the next. It was a memory system, engineered to preserve information across centuries without letting it change. A living archive, defended against error by the fear of death itself. And Matthews knew, better than most, what it costs to build a machine like that. He had spent his life inside institutions that tried to preserve knowledge with paper and ink and archives, and he had watched paper burn, and ink fade, and archives get thrown out by the next administration. Here was a people who had solved the problem of preservation without a single written word, by binding their history to a ceremony so sacred and so exact that altering it was unthinkable. It was, in its way, a more durable technology than anything in his own civilization. And it had been used to preserve exactly one kind of information above all others, not recipes, not the genealogies of kings, the story of how the world ends and how the survivors get out. Of all the things a culture could choose to protect with its most powerful memory system, the Navajo chose to protect the instructions for surviving the end of a world. Matthews noticed that it is very hard to read his careful, restrained prose and not feel that it unsettled him deeply. And Matthews understood exactly what that meant. A culture that goes to those extraordinary lengths to keep something exact is a culture that believes the thing it is keeping is true. Not true like a nice story that teaches a lesson. True like a record, like a deed to a house. The Navajo were not decorating their history to make it more entertaining. They were guarding it the way you guard the one document you cannot afford to lose. He spent years on it. He damaged his own health doing it. Late in his life, illness took his hearing and slowed his hand, and he worked against the clock to get as much of it down as he possibly could before he lost the ability entirely, because he understood that when the last singers who held the full ceremonies died, anything he had not captured would be gone from the surface of the earth forever. He was not romanticizing these people from a comfortable distance. He was racing, sick and half-deaf, to save something he was genuinely afraid the world was about to lose without ever realizing what it had. And here is the part that should genuinely trouble you. What Washington Matthews wrote down is not always identical to what later readers were eventually given. His work passed, as all such work inevitably does, through the hands of editors and institutions and later compilers, every one of them with their own priorities and their own sense of what was fit to print. Accounts got smoothed over. Passages that were difficult, or that were offensive to the delicate sensibilities of a later era, or that were simply too hard to explain neatly, had a way of getting trimmed, softened, footnoted into the tiny print in the margins, or quietly dropped altogether. This happens to almost every raw account of an indigenous tradition recorded in that period. The sharp edges get filed down. The parts that refuse to fit the tidy little category of quaint native myth get set aside where nobody has to look at them. And so the version of the world before this one that filters down to us through the popularizers and the summaries and the encyclopedia entries is a cleaned-up version, a safe version, with the most unsettling specifics, the exact mechanics of how a world ends and what comes up out of it, worn smooth by 100 years of careful handling. And I want to be careful here, because I am not claiming some grand conspiracy in a smoke-filled room. The truth is quieter, and in some ways worse. Things get lost because the people handling them do not think they matter. An editor in 1910 who trims a passage he finds distasteful is not hiding a secret. He simply cannot imagine that the strange, dark, specific thing the old singer said is more important than his own sense of what belongs in a respectable book. That is how real erasure works. Not with a lock and a vault, but with 1,000 small decisions by people who were certain the missing piece was worthless. Multiply that across a century of editions and summaries and school syllabi, each one a little cleaner and a little safer than the last, and you end up exactly where we are, with a version of the story that has had all of its teeth pulled, presented to us as the whole of it. The reset, it turns out, does not only happen to worlds. It happens to the memory of worlds, quietly, in every generation that decides the frightening parts are not worth keeping. The full account, the raw one, the one closest to what the old singer actually said by lamplight to a sick surgeon who could barely hear him anymore, is stranger and darker and far more specific than the tidy summary anyone will ever hand you in a classroom. So let me put the whole shape of it back together for you now, because once you see it as a single connected thing, it becomes very hard to unsee. There was a world. Its people ruined it from within, and they were driven upward out of it. There was a second world. They repeated themselves almost exactly, and they were driven upward again. There was a third world, wide and beautiful and full of crossing rivers, and it was destroyed by a flood that came from below and only stopped the moment a stolen thing was finally returned. The survivors climbed through a hollow reed into this world, the one under your feet right now, and the very first thing they did upon arriving was seal the door behind them. And then they had to hunt down and kill the monsters that had come up with them, the living consequences of everything they had done in the worlds below, before they could finally live in any kind of peace. Now, ask the only question that really matters. Why does the sequence repeat? Why does every world end the same way, from the same flaw, for the same underlying reasons? Because that is the actual message buried down inside this whole account, and it is not a comforting one. Each world did not end because of bad luck or random misfortune. Each world ended because its people did the very same thing their ancestors had done in the world just beneath them. They took what was not theirs to take. They broke their agreements with one another and with the powers above them. They let their appetites run straight past every limit they had been given, and they refused, right up until the water was climbing at their throats, to give back what they had stolen. The account is not really about the past at all. It is a warning, delivered in the shape of history. The people who carried it were telling their children something very simple and very terrible. This has happened before. It happened more than once. It happens for the same reason every single time, and there is no law of the universe, written anywhere, that says it cannot happen one more time to the world you are standing on at this very moment. And if you are waiting for me to tell you what form it would take, I cannot, and neither could the singers. That is not how the pattern works. The first world did not end the way the third world ended. The mechanism changes. What does not change is the cause. Every world ended because the people in it took what was not theirs and refused to give it back until it was too late. The flood is just the shape the consequence happened to take that time. The next consequence, if there is one, will wear whatever shape our particular thefts have earned. You do not get to know in advance what the water will look like. You only get to know that it rises, that it comes from below, from the ground you were sure was solid, and that it has come before for people exactly as confident as we are that their world was the permanent one. We think of ourselves as the top floor, the finished world, the permanent one, the one all of history was aiming at. So did the people of the first world, and the second, and the third. Every one of those worlds felt permanent to the beings living inside it, right up until the exact moment the water started to rise or the order came down to shut the door. The Navajo account does not promise, anywhere, that this world is the last one. It only tells you, over and over, that this world is the latest one, and the difference between those two small words is the entire crushing weight of the thing. If the pattern is real, then the only thing that has ever stopped it, the single act that ever once halted the flood mid-rise, was the moment the people finally returned what they had taken and set right the wrong that was drowning them. That is the elixir hidden at the very bottom of the whole account, not a prophecy of certain doom, a condition. The world before this one ended because the correction came too late, or came only at the very last instant with the water already inside the reed. Whether this world follows the others down through the same trapdoor is, if the old singers were telling the truth, entirely a question of whether its people can learn the one lesson every previous world failed to learn until it was already too late. And that, in the end, is why this account has survived when so much else was allowed to rot. Not because it is a good story, though it is, because it is useful. It is an instruction manual disguised as a history, passed hand to hand across an unbroken chain of memory, and its instruction is brutally simple. When you have taken something that is not yours, and the water starts to rise, do not wait. Give it back. Set it right. Do it before the reed, not inside it. Every world that failed to do that is sealed beneath you right now. The one world that did it, barely, in the last desperate feat of the climb, is the reason you are here to hear any of this at all. Washington Matthews died in 1905, his hearing gone, his great work not quite finished, privately convinced that he had been handed something the world around him was nowhere near ready to understand. He left behind pages that most people have never read, describing worlds almost no one alive believes ever existed, sealed beneath the one we casually walk on every day. He had nothing to gain from inventing any of it. The people who told him had nothing to gain from lying to him. And the account they had preserved across uncounted centuries, with the fear of death itself standing guard over every single word, says the same thing that the buried memories of a dozen other peoples say, in their own languages, from their own deserts and coastlines and mountains. There was a world before this one. It ended, and the door was shut behind us, deliberately, for a reason. I have put the full reconstruction, the raw account laid side by side with what the later editions quietly removed, into the document linked in the description below this video. If any of this went anywhere near the part of you that has always quietly suspected the official story is missing an entire chapter, then do one single thing for me before you go. Go and read it for yourself. And then decide, on your own, which world we are really standing on. The door is still down there, and it has been opened before, from below.